Hey friends, welcome to Homegrown Florida. I'm Patrina, and for the last 10 years I have been growing bush beans, bush green beans to be exact. And I've been a little less than impressed with how much the productivity is. Yeah, I've gotten some green beans, I've gotten a decent amount, I've been happy with them. But in 2025, one of my main goals was to grow a year's supply of green beans, and it wasn't gonna cut it the way that I was doing it before. So I decided to test a bunch of things out to see what it was that was making my green beans less productive than I would like. Everything from variety to how they're grown to the styles that grow. So let's get into it and figure out which one is the most productive in the garden. So we're gonna start out with container versus raised bed versus in-ground. So I grew them pretty much all the ways. I don't have a lot of in-ground growing, so I kind of just assumed that in-ground would be very similar in between container versus raised bed. And the reason why I say that is typically you can get higher productivity out of a raised bed because of the way that the soil is. It's not compacted ever. You know, the soil that's put in there is like really, really good. And when you're starting with in-ground, you maybe aren't necessarily starting with the best soil. You're starting with whatever your soil is. And then you amend it over time. So depending on, you know, your amendment strategy, you know, how you're feeding the soil, whether you're doing cover cropping, whether you're adding stuff, all that is going to depend on, you know, how rich that soil is, how much, you know, space between plants that you're doing. Like there's a lot that goes into it. But I kind of just assumed that it would be somewhere between a container and a raised bed in my experience. But we did do container. This is a green stalk vertical container where I added a bunch of bush beans. Now green stalk says that you can do 3 green bean or bush green bean plants per pocket. I have done that in the past and I have found that they are not that good at 3 per pocket. So I actually only did 2 per pocket this time, and I feel like they did much better. And by much better, this is what I'm talking about, which is so far I've picked, what is this, 4 plants, and I don't even have enough for dinner. This is the second harvest, so I'm not like totally bashing container gardening when it comes to this. My first harvest was much larger, it was much better, but it still wasn't great, you guys. It's what I've been talking about for a year now. Why are these beans just not as productive as, you know, other plants in the garden? These should be doing so much better. And I'm like, what is it? So anyway, I did less plants to think that maybe it was a spacing issue in the container, but it seems to be doing about the same that it has in previous years, which isn't bad. It's great for, you know, a couple meals, but it's not anything that's going to feed my family for a year. So they are a great idea to do, but I'm not sure that there is the most productivity when it comes to growing them in a container. So let's get the rest of these off and I'll show you how many I got, and then we'll count up the number of plants so that you can see what we're dealing with. There's still a few on here, but they're pretty small, so I'm gonna leave them. Yep, I think we got all of the decent sized ones. We got a fistful, not a appropriate sizing guide, but you know, basically like my dinner, you know, maybe a little bit for my husband. And we're talking about, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 plants gave me this. It's gonna take probably about another week or 2 before these plants have a second flush or a third flush now and give us more. So just a handful from 13 plants once a week, yeah, that's not gonna feed us for a year. Next up is going to be in a raised bed. So we saw how many were in the container. How many does a raised bed get you? And you would think that it would be more. In my past experiences, I have seen raised beds do a higher productivity, and I assume that is because the bed is deeper, it's open on the bottom, so if the roots want to spread down past, you know, the raised bed down into the native soil, they can do that. Generally, a raised bed is going to hold water better, so all of those things kind of contribute to it having, you know, higher productivity. Just is what it is, right? So in this bed, in all transparency, these are not green beans. These are dry beans. But I have grown green beans in raised beds before, and honestly, I already kind of knew the answer, which was that in the container or in the raised bed, they kind of do the same. And that's holding true right here. So if you can see, I have these beans right here, and there's like 5 of them on this one. Well, 6. There's 6 on this one plant right here. 6. That's it. That's all I'm going to get. Now, these are dry beans, so they're going to continue on. We're not going to pick them off today. My container green beans had about 5 when I first harvested them too. So like, this is, once again, 5. Now, I could put a lot more plants in this bed than I can in those. So I have like 13 plants in that. I probably have like, I don't know, 30, 35 plants. I'm not really sure. I didn't count, but there is a lot of plants in this bed because you can space them all the way up to like 3 inches apart. I give mine more space because I feel like they produce more if you give them more space when you're talking about bush beans. So mine are probably like 6 inches. They probably have 6 inches in half a bed, so a 4x4 square foot area. And I probably have like 30 of them in here, 35, something. They're doing a second flush right now, so they are getting another round of flowers. So I will get probably 10 beans per plant, and then it depends on how many pods are in each one of these as to how many dry beans I'm gonna get. But you can kind of get the idea that bush green beans are gonna behave in the same way, and they have for me in the past. So if it's not container versus raised bed, what is the big difference between these two? Well, the next thing it could be is variety. So I've grown a lot of different varieties of green beans. Some of my favorites for down here in Florida are going to be Provider, Contender, Blue Lake, Bush. Those are usually the ones that I typically grow, and those are actually the ones that I am growing over there in the green stalk. These are a different style. Like I said, they're dry beans, so it's like a light red kidney bean, little red bean. I've done Azuco beans, I've done cranberry beans, I've done cannelloni beans, I've done a lot of different kinds of beans. So I thought maybe for many years that it was the different varieties that could be attributing to how much I was getting. And that did seem to be somewhat true. I've kind of found that Provider was a good grower, but probably the least productive. And then for me, Contender seemed to be the highest productivity, with Blue Lake Bush being somewhere in the middle. I kind of go between Contender and Blue Lake the most because I feel like Blue Lake does a second flush in a much more aggressive fashion than Contender does. So you kind of, in the long run, Contender and Blue Lake seem like they produce the same amount. Based on the number of flushes that they have and how many beans you get per flush. Usually I'm only getting 2 or 3 flushes if I'm lucky. You know, sometimes if you notice, some of these plants are starting to not look so great. There's a lot of like chew marks happening. There is some discoloration on the leaves. There's something, there's rust happening. There's always something that happens to these beans. I know that some folks, like, they, you know, put them in and they start getting a harvest and they're like, why is it going downhill so fast? I don't think bush beans or green beans are designed to be like this long growing vegetable. They're not like tomatoes where they're just going to keep growing, or kale where it lasts the entire season. These are one of the plants that you have to succession plant because they give up pretty quickly and something overtakes them very quickly. Right now I've got bean leaf rollers that are chewing them up, which you can treat for with spinoside or BT. I also have like a nutrient thing happening here, which I assume they're just running out, and I could give them nutrients, but it doesn't seem to help at this stage. Or they get like a rust or fungal issue because, you know, we're entering in some of our rainy season. You know, almost there. We've had a couple good rains and that seems to be bothering them. It just seems like they're just a really short-living plant. Think like radishes and lettuces, right? They'll produce, they'll give you some, and then they just tap out. That's kind of like how I view green beans. They give you a flush, 2, 3 if you're lucky, and then they just give up. So you really need to be succession planting them. But it seems like it just takes so many plants to get just enough to feed us through the season, much less a year's supply. So if it's not container versus raised bed, if it's not certain varieties produce more than others, then what else could it be? Well, here's the big secret. This is what I have learned this season, and I am so ecstatic to learn it. It's actually bush versus vining. I stumbled on this little trick by complete accident. I wanted to grow some vining green beans to go along with my corn and my squash that I'm growing here so that I could have a Three Sisters garden. I wanted to do the official Three Sisters, and I knew that I needed a vining bean to do that. Now there are dry beans, and I was thinking about that, but I was like, you know what? Green beans are part of my year goal to grow a year's supply of green beans. So let me find a vining green bean. And then I found Blue Lake pole beans, not Blue Lake bush beans, but Blue Lake pole beans. So I'm like, oh, maybe they're similar. I know Blue Lake bush works. Let's try Blue Lake vine. There's only 10 plants here, guys. There's 5 on this side. Actually, I think it's 9. There's 5 on this side and there's only 4 on that side. So we're talking 9 plants. And so far, this has produced so many green beans for me. It is insane. Far surpassing the container 13, far surpassing the 30, 35 that are in the raised bed. It's the pole varieties. And I think the reason for that is these guys are designed to grow for longer periods of time. A bush is kind of, think of it like tomatoes, right? So you have indeterminate and then determinate tomatoes. An indeterminate tomato grows for as long as the climate allows. It just keeps getting higher, higher, higher. So you keep having to like increase the trellis size and stuff. But a determinate tomato only grows to a determinate size. And once it reaches that spot, then it just pushes out all of its tomatoes, ripens them, and then that's it. That's all they're gonna produce. I think the same is happening for bush versus pole beans. When the bush plant gets big enough and it produces all of its beans and it pushes them out, it will sometimes struggle through a second or a third flush. For the most part, it starts going downhill. Whereas the vining ones, they seem to be getting more productive as they grow. With all transparency, they take much longer. Like these are growing in much, much, much slower than the other ones. But once they hit the trellis, it took them a while to hit the trellis. Once they hit the trellis and they started to grow upwards, it started to speed up. The first set of flowers didn't happen for 1.5 feet. So these plants got very, very tall before they even set their first single flower. And then after it set its first single flower, then they got to like 6-inch distances between it. And then when you get all the way up to the top here, they're like 2 inches apart, there's flower sets. So it'll grow 2 inches, it'll have a flower set. Grow 2 inches, have a flower set. It is growing at a phenomenal pace now and producing an immense amount of flowers now. It's pretty crazy to me how much they are outperforming now. Slow to start, but now performing much, much quicker. So let's see how many we can get off of these plants, just 9, as compared to the ones that we pulled off our containers. I think this is going to take even longer than I thought. This is just one plant and I'm not even through with the whole plant yet. This is going to take a while. We definitely got a lot more. This is probably double what we got from the containers, and I didn't even pull them all off because I feel like they're a little smaller than I would like. I want them to size up a little bit more, and there are hundreds on here. So it's kind of going to be like the peas if you watched me harvest my peas. I'm going to harvest bunches, and I suspect that these are going to produce every few days because I can see them and they're at different stages of growth all throughout the plant. So probably every few days I'm going to be pulling off this. And then what I'll do is I'll take like basically this bunch right here and I will eat it or I'm going to blanch them, vacuum seal them, and freeze them for later. So I suspect at some point, with as aggressively as it's growing, it's going to start producing even faster than what it's producing right now. But still, I'm dropping them. I can't hold them in both hands. I'm definitely getting way more off of these. Now, obviously, there are some downside of growing pole versus bush beans, and that's going to be trellising and size. So they seem to grow just fine in any size bed, I think, like bed, container even. Like I could probably put them in my green stalks. The problem that you're going to come up with is these guys like to climb. As you can see, they're way down here and they're climbing all the way up here. And this plant is all the way over here. And I suspect it's going to do some more growing. So these guys are aggressive climbers. So you're going to have to give it something to climb. Now, thankfully, they're not super heavy plants, so that it doesn't have to be like an arch trellis. It doesn't have to be, you know, a cattle panel. You can do probably, I would think, a tomato cage or maybe even like chicken wire that you make into like a circle and set it inside of your pot if you wanted to use a container. But they are really aggressive growers, so you definitely want to give them something to climb. You could even have them climb something like a palm tree, a fruit tree, a wooden fence, maybe not so much on the vinyl fences because there's not anything for them to grip onto, but a wooden fence has some texture, they can climb onto that. Like, just think outside the box when it comes to climbing plants, especially if you're a small space grower and maybe you only have containers or you have a very small garden space. You can sneak these in different places, and with how productive these vining varieties are, you don't need as many plants. Like, I have 9 plants and I'm pretty sure these 9 and the rest of what the others are going to give me is going to give me a year's supply. We'll see. Make sure you follow along, hit that subscribe and that notification bell so that way you can follow along, because I'm going to do an update on my 3 sisters and see how that corn, squash, and these beans are going to be doing. And if you want to learn more about how to grow vegetables in Florida, make sure to check out my Homegrown Florida Gardening Guide ebook. It is down in the description, or you can find it at my website, homegrownfloridagarden.com. Happy gardening, guys!